Hello my friend, in this video I want to talk about mixing electric bass guitar, in this case for a rock track, and how I use multiband compression to achieve a round, full bass guitar with character that sits really nice in the mix. So with no further ado, let's dive into it. So first let's listen to the raw bass guitar recording without EQing, compressing whatsoever. Okay, as you can hear, the bass already sounds solid. It has a nice tone and also a little character. But now we want to enhance the character and focus on compression to get a round and even bass sound with more presence. For this approach, I'll copy the bass guitar 2 times, giving us 3 bass tracks total. So on the first track, we are focusing on the low end. On the second track, we are focusing on the low mids and high range and high frequencies. And on the third track we are adding distortion just to get a little bit more character and presence. Each track will have its own EQing, compressing and processing. And then we blend them to get the final bass sound. So let's start with the low range track, the first track. So now I grab an EQ and do a high cut at 200 Hz, so only the low frequencies remain. And as you can see, we have a 48 dB slope, so that only the low frequencies remain. Let's listen to that. And now we're adding a little distortion. For that, I'm using the Cubase omnichannel from Waves, and the saturation is great because before we compress the signal, distortion also has an impact on the dynamic range, and the tone gets a little fuller, and it sounds more in a nice pocket. But we have to experiment with that. So I'm turning down the saturation knob, as you can see. It's the pre section here, saturation, and we are using the even mode because it's not too much distortion. And while we are listening, we'll dial in the saturation knob. That's too much, of course. Yeah, let's keep it at 50%. Whatever that means. Yeah. To my ears it sounds much more even, round, and of course we have an increase of the volume, but I already took down the output just 2 to 3 dBs just to make sure that our gain staging is okay. But to my ears it sounds great. Let's listen to it again. Switch it off. Yeah, I like what it does to the signal. So now we are grabbing a compressor, and the goal here is just to tame a little bit more the dynamic peaks and the compression at the max 2 to 3 dBs. So these also are just numbers, but that's a nice starting point. Of course, you have to find out by taste. For now, let's focus on 2 to 3 dBs and listen to the signal and listen how it sounds. And as you can see, the ratio is 4:1, attack 20 milliseconds and release 5 milliseconds, which is quite fast, but to my ears it sounds great. And we are leaving the output at 0. To my ears it sounds much more even, round and nice. Alright, so let's move on to the second track, which is the high track. And again, I'll grab an EQ, and in this case we are rolling off the low end, and we're setting the high pass at 200 Hz, so that only the low mids and the high frequencies remain. Let's listen to that track. And then we're also adding a little saturation. Let's grab the Cubase Omni channel again. That will be too much to my ears. Yeah. Even though those numbers can help sometimes, but they're not important. It's much more important how it sounds and what it does to the signal. In this case, we have 67% and it sounds great. Also, we're using the even mode. Alright, again, let's grab a compressor. And the goal here is also just to have a gain reduction 2 to 3 dBs. Numbers are not the important part, it's more how it sounds. But it's a nice starting point. Let's listen to that. We have the same ratio here, 4:1, 20 milliseconds attack and 5 milliseconds release. And let's listen to that. Yeah, sounds much more even to my ears. So now we are blending them together, the low track and the high track. Let's see how it sounds. We start with the low track, and while we're listening to that, I will dial in the high track. Yeah, to my ears, it already sounds much more even and round, and of course, it's much more in the pocket. So now let's move to the third track, which is the distortion track. And again, we are grabbing the EQ and set the high pass filter at 200 Hertz again, so that only the low mids and the high frequencies remain. And again, we're adding a little distortion with the same tool, Cubase Omni channel. And let's listen to the track. In this case, we're taking the heavy mode, which of course adds another kind of distortion, which is much more aggressive. And while we're listening to the bass track, I will dial in the saturation. Let's switch it off. Of course, we have an increase of the volume, but also of the distortion. So now let's get a little bit more distortion for that track. And in this case, I'm using a stock plugin from Cubase, the Steinberg Tube, which is a tube saturation tool. In this case, all in 100%. Let's listen to that track. Yeah, a lot of distortion, and it's adding this amp feel. It sounds if you recorded the bass through an amp, and that's also a nice aspect with the third track. It's the distortion, this presence and character to the track, and also the vibe of a fake or recorded bass amp. So now let's listen to the first two tracks, and then we're blending in the distortion channel. Yeah, I love it. And of course, it's a matter of taste. There's no right or wrong. It depends on the playback, the drums, the electric guitars, how much of the distortion channel you need for the sound of the bass guitar in this special case. And of course, you can use an amp simulator or whatever. There are no rules at all. I mean, in this case, the tube works very well to my ears, but you can use any kind of distortion tool. Alright, let's listen to the drums and the rest of the playback with the bass guitar. I will turn down the distortion channel and dial it in back again. Yeah, immediately you can hear the bass much better in the mix. But let's go a step further with that and take the 3 bass tracks and routing them to a certain bass bus, and then adding a little bit more EQing and compressing or limiting. So I will grab an EQ and I will roll off the very low end just to make a little room for the bass drum. But of course also here you have to do it by taste, and there are no fixed rules, but in this case it makes sense. So let's listen to that. With the drums. Sounds nice to my ears. And we're adding a limiter. In this case I'm using the Hofer compressor again, but with a ratio of 10:1, because now the compressor works like a limiter. And we have a tag 25 milliseconds and a release at 5 milliseconds. Let's listen to that. Yeah, and the goal with the limiter here is just to tame another 1 at max 2 dB of the dynamic range, so that we have a gain reduction 1 to 2 dB at most. And of course, you have to find out the right blend of the 3 bass tracks. And it depends on the playback, on the drums, on the guitars. But to my ears, in this case, the bass sounds much more even, has a nice low end, has a nice character through the 3rd bass track, the distortion track. That sounds great. So let's listen to the whole track again. Yeah, so to my ears, the bass cuts through the mix. It sits really nice in the mix, has enough low end, and works together with the drums well. And that's a great basis for the later mix. So that's my approach to mixing a bass guitar in a rock mix. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.